Hello! Welcome to another video on my channel. For those of you who don't know or can't tell by my accent, I am from Germany, Bavaria specifically. For graduation this year, me and my Austrian friend decided to wear the traditional dress from our region, called the dirndl. They look like this. The only problem is I don't own one, and I don't like the look of most of them that I could afford, so I decided to make my own. I really like the whole cottagecore aesthetic of them, but I couldn't decide on a design. Until I stumbled over this picture from the store French Meadows. Everything in this picture can be purchased, there is a link in the description. I really like the look of this, so I decided to create something similar. I am aware that this is not gonna look like a dirndl in the end, but you know, vaguely kinda reminds you of one. It's fine, it's gonna work out. Don't worry about it. First challenge was to find the same fabric for the stays as used by French Meadows. I didn't need the exact same, but I really liked the picture because of that fabric. It took me a while, but I found it on Etsy. The link is also in the description. It's fairly expensive. I bought about 2 yards, but I only needed 1. And every other thicker canvas fabric would have worked too. Then I bought a pattern also from Etsy, link is in description, and I got started on a mock-up. I cut out the pattern pieces from a cheap polyester fabric on the floor, as that gave me enough room to work. It had the unfortunate side effect that my dog Caputo thought this was clearly a group activity. I cut out both sides, trying to maneuver around my pet bear, who seemed to play the cat on the keyboard game. Like, how can somebody be this cute and this annoying simultaneously? Once they are all cut out, I sewed them all together. I made sure to have a lot of seam allowance on both sides of each pattern piece. I folded over that seam allowance in the end and sewed it down, about 1.5 centimeters away from the first seam, to create boning channels. Then I grabbed a bag of large zip ties, cut off the top and inserted them into my boning channels. Of course, you can also use real boning, but zip ties work just as well. Then I tried it on and realized my mistake. If I used my fancy fabric, I want it shown as much as possible, so I would need a pattern that uses way less pieces. So I wouldn't have to cut my fabric too much and interfere with the pattern. So I went and bought a different pattern, in a different style, closer to the one used by French Meadows. Link again in description. I repeated the same step, traced the pattern onto my fabric. Then I also marked the boning channel placement. I figured out that I could place my fabric on top of the pattern piece and trace the boning channel placement through it. Then I sewed it all together. I placed the whole thing on the same kind of fabric I used, had a stern word with my pupa not to disturb me this time, and cut it out. I sewed both pieces together along the pattern, but made sure to leave the bottom open so that I could insert the boning later. Speaking of, I also sewed along all of the boning channel markings, and then I inserted the boning. Now, due to my floor being dirty and also dog infested, I moved onto the kitchen table, placing my mock-up thingy onto the fancy fabric. Then I cut around it, flipped it over, placing it so that the ugly side faced inwards. Then I sewed around all of the boning channels. And around the whole thing, as well as the bottom, closing all the boning channels. The straps and the area where the straps will be attached to need to be sturdy. So I sewed on an extra patch of canvas. Then I folded over the rest of the fabric and sewed it in place by hand. This does not need to look fancy, as it will be covered up later. For the same reason that I wanted to strengthen the straps, I also left a long piece of fabric over the area where the back lacing will be. And now I fold it over and sewed it in place as well. Now for a third time, I placed the whole thing on some fabric, the lining fabric. I pinned it down, cut it out, then cut around it again closer to the edge. I folded over the border and pinned it down, sewing it in place. Then I grabbed some binding tape and pinned it around the border of the outer side, sewing it down. Don't ask me how I dealt with the corners, I just kinda did. Doesn't look too great, but it's also not really visible. Once that is done, I flipped it over and pinned it to the inside and sewed it down as well. Now it was time to install the grommets. I did a less than stellar job, so I decided to sew over them to hide them and protect my ribbon from the sharp metal pieces that I managed to create somehow. Now I laced it up and it's done. I followed this instructional drawing. It's not too complicated, it's just important that the side pieces are out so that you can use it later to tighten the corset. Before we move on to the skirt, let's have a quick break and look at what happened when you tell a Newfoundland mix that he will need to take a bath that day. This took about an hour and a half to clean in the shower. Not a fun time. Okay, now onto the skirt. I had about 5 meters of this green fabric. I figured out how long I wanted it to be and cut the rest off the bottom. I hemmed the bottom edge with the leftovers of my binding tape. I really wanted to include some nice detail around the skirt, so I picked this picture from Instagram and got started on recreating that. So I grabbed the fabric I had left over that I cut off from the bottom and cut it into smaller strips, around 15 centimeters wide. I sewed them all together with French seams. That means you sew them together normally, then trim down the seam allowance, flip it over and sew it again, so you have a clean seam at the end that won't fray. Now, the strips need to be much longer than your skirt panel. Mine is about triple the length, and I needed almost all of it. Now I sew down lines about a ruler's width apart. Then I flipped over every second of those and sewed it together. It's hard to explain, but basically I ended up with Kapu napping and myself frustrated, and a strip of fabric with a bunch of loops in it. I then pinned all of them down at the midpoint and sewed along the edges. Then I ironed them down. Once that was accomplished, I grabbed each iron loop and pinched the ends together at about the midpoint. Then I sewed that spot together, slightly out of frame to make sure no one can see what I'm doing. I swear one day I will be getting this YouTuber thing. Once it looks like you have about 1 million little bow ties, you're done. Or rather, I'm done. You did nothing, let's be honest. Now I figured out where in the skirt I wanted my bow tie snake to be. I then cut the skirt at that point and made a sandwich with the lower part of the skirt panel and the bow tie snake, good sides facing each other, and sewed that together. Then I repeated that step with the other side, getting somewhat distracted by Kapu being a cutie. Look at that face. Now it gets weird, and probably not how one should go about this, but this is what I did. I changed the width of the stitches. What is this? The stitch width. You know what I mean. To about 5 millimeters on my sewing machine, and sewed one straight line down across the top of the skirt panel. Then I pulled on one of those threads until I gathered it up to about the length of my waist. Then I sewed across the top. Then I changed my mind and decided instead making multiple of those lines, gathering them all up together until it looks about like this. So I seam ripped everything apart again and then started over. I sewed 5 lines, more or less parallel to each other. Then I gathered them all together until they were a bit more than the circumference of my waist. I grabbed 2 pieces of the white fabric, measured them to be the length of my waist, and sewed a bunch of little boning channels into them, and stuffed every second one of them with a bone made from a box that my assistant was nice enough to ruin for me. Then I sewed the channels closed. Now I grabbed a piece of the green fabric that was double the size of the white boning channel piece. I sandwiched it in between the bone piece and the gathered skirt. Now I marked all the channels that didn't have boning in them, so that I could then use those channels to sew together bone piece and skirt, making sure not to sew over the green fabric that I had folded out of the way. Then I flipped it over and pinned it down, hiding the gathering and the bone piece. I then sewed this in place. Now the reason why I added that bone thingy is because I didn't want the waistband to roll up. I wanted it wide and structured. I am aware that there is a material that you can use for literally that reason, but I didn't have any of it and I couldn't be bothered to research it. Now I sewed on some skirt hooks. Now, I would usually not be a stickler for finishing edges and the inside of skirts, but this one frayed quite a lot. So I rolled up the unfinished seams, pinned them down and sewed them in place. The last touch was to pin and then sew in place this black ribbon above and below the bow tie snake. I added a blouse that I already had and the dress was done. Now onto the reveal. I'm overall really happy with how it turned out. As you can clearly see, I am, however, not really good at shooting reveals. It can be nice and swooshy. Kapu seems to be a big fan as well, but to be fair, he's a big fan of everything. This is me and my friend trying to make a dramatic shot, and then Kapu just being way too excited about it. The back seems to lace up a little uneven and I think it needs a modesty panel. It is a tiny bit uncomfortable under the arms, so it might need some alterations in the future. But other than that, I'm pretty happy. Me and Kapu say bye bye. Please like and subscribe if you liked it, and thanks for watching.